7, 8, 9, 10. Good evening and welcome. I am Melanie Ramey, the chair of the board of the Madison Committee on Foreign Relations, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this, our first event of the fall season. I appreciate your indulgence in terms of joining with us in a virtual seminar, as we had originally planned, of course, that we could all meet in person and have dinner together, but life being what it is, that turned out not to be a wise thing to do. So I want to also, though, before we begin this evening, to call your attention to the next session, which will be on October 19th, and that will be at 7 p.m. and it will be on a webinar on the Kurds. The Kurds must stateless mean friendless. And I don't think we've ever really had a presentation on the Kurds. And so we are really pleased to have Dr. David Romano from Missouri State University, who is a scholar, well-known scholar on minority populations in the Middle East. And he will be the presenter then. So be sure and put that on your calendar, because I think we'll get a lot of new information that we haven't had before. I would also call your attention this evening to open up your chat room, because the chat room is where we will take questions for Ambassador Green. So if you will open the chat room, and most of your screens will probably be along the bottom of the screen. If it isn't, then there's usually an icon that says more. So click on more and the chat room icon will come open and you can begin to think of your questions. So without further ado, I want to introduce this evening's presenter. And this is actually a homegrown presenter in the form of Ambassador Mark Green. Ambassador Green is now the president and CEO of the Wilson Institute for Scholars, the Wilson Institute and Center for Scholars. Ambassador Green has been in Wisconsin for some time. He is a graduate of the University Law School. He was in the Wisconsin Assembly, and he represented the 8th Congressional District in U.S. Congress. After that, he served as ambassador to Tanzania, and then he has served in several other leadership positions, and has taken this position just recently in March of this year at the Wilson Institute for International Scholars. So we're really happy to welcome him, and he is going to talk with us about an extremely timely topic, being American Leadership Matters. And I know there will be a lot of questions, and Ambassador Green will speak about 25 or 30 minutes, and then we will be discussing the questions that you have with him. So without further ado, let's hear from Ambassador Mark Green.
Great, thanks, Melanie, and good evening, everyone. Yeah, I'll probably keep my remarks a little bit briefer than that, and just look forward to questions. Hope everyone had a relaxing, healthy, safe Labor Day weekend. Believe it or not, it's actually Labor Day, or at least one Labor Day, that I'd like to use to help set the stage for my remarks. So 20 years ago last week, Labor Day, 2001, George W. Bush, Bush 43 as we call him, spent that Labor Day, some may remember, in Kokona, Wisconsin, in the 8th Congressional District. And he spent it with me. And it was a remarkable time. I had never really met the new president at that point. I had met him in a receiving line, but never really spent much time with him. And so he came in for the usual political ceremonies around Labor Day, and we went to the apprenticeship hall in Kokona. And it was a great day. And we talked about the importance of labor and honoring labor. But I remember in particular the drive that I had with George W. Bush from Kokona back to the airport in Green Bay. Just the two of us in the car. And I remember asking him, Mr. President, what do you want to work on? He talked about tax reform. We talked about education reform. We talked about energy reform, all domestic issues. And then 8 days later was 9/11. And I remember seeing President Bush again in October of that year, some days after, of course, the actions that brought us into Afghanistan were underway. And I saw him in a receiving line. And when he came to shake hands, I stopped him for a moment. And I said, Mr. President, do you remember that drive back in Kokona? And he looked at me and he shook his head sadly and he said, yeah, blown clear out of the water. In other words, he had suddenly become a wartime president. And I think that's something that is a lesson for all of us. You know, we have a number of challenges, obviously, domestically, but we have to pay attention to what takes place in the far corners of the world, whether it be the attacks of 9/11 or whether it be the emergence of COVID-19, it matters. We are in an interconnected world, and we really do have to care about what goes on in those areas. You know, in 1998, when I first ran for Congress, if you would have told me that in foreign policy we would be dealing with a devastating attack launched essentially from the remote regions of Afghanistan that would strike the heart of New York City, of course, I wouldn't have believed you. And we all learned the hard way that we do have to care, that we do have to pay attention, and we do have to be vigilant. And it really is that same sense that brought me to the Woodrow Wilson Center back a few months ago. So the Woodrow Wilson Center is part of the Smithsonian Institute, actually. It was chartered by Congress a little over 50 years ago. The congressional charter, the legislation, says that the mission of the Wilson Center is strengthening the fruitful relation between the world of learning and the world of public affairs. And that's what we do. Our board is presidentially appointed. Technically, Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Health and Human Services, Secretary of the Smithsonian, all sit on our board. Our Global Advisory Council is co-chaired by former General David Petraeus and Sir John Scarlett, the former head of British Secret Services. We were recently voted yet again the #1 regional studies institute in the entire world. When I was first approached about joining the Woodrow Wilson Center, I was at the McCain Institute. And quite frankly, I said no. I was enjoying the work that I was doing. I know Cindy McCain very well from previous work that I had done, and was enjoying that work. But the person who reached out to me said, take a look at this platform. Take a look at the scholars who have come through the Woodrow Wilson Center, from Madeleine Albright to Peter Baker, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and think about what the possibilities are for bringing forward that notion of applied learning to the challenges that we face today. And the more I spent time looking at the opportunities, the more excited I became, and then was fortunate enough to be able to join in March. My role at the Woodrow Wilson Center as president and CEO is to really harness the great talent that we have. We have about a dozen semi-independent institutions inside the Wilson Center. We have a Kissinger Institute, Kennan Institute, Canada-Mexico Institutes, and to try to take that deep talent, that deep scholarship, and make it relevant to the policy choices and challenges facing lawmakers these days. We are essentially Congress's think tank. We don't tell Congress what to do. We don't tell analysts what to do, but we try to take lessons from what we see in the research channel that we have and tee up options. We don't tell people what to do or what to say, but we make sure that they understand the ramifications of the choices that we make. My mission is to try to make us relevant, to make sure that that scholarship is applied in decision-making these days. My mission is to reinforce the relevance without resorting to clickbait or misinformation. I'm delighted to be out of the political arena where that seems to be so common. I said somewhat in jest that my job in many ways at the Wilson Center is teaching the elephant to dance, is taking this enormous intellectual might that we have at the center and trying to make it more nimble, trying to make it more relevant, again, with all that's going on. And if you go to the Wilson Center website, you can see some of the work that we've taken on in the last few months. So in July, we had an event in which we celebrated or we honored the first anniversary of the USMCA agreement, the US-Mexico-Canada trade deal. And we brought together all three trade ministers at once for a virtual conference in which they talked about the importance of trade and also talked about some of the challenges that they see for full implementation. You'll also see it in a program that I launched a few weeks ago called Hindsight Upfront: Lessons and Repercussions of the Withdrawal from Afghanistan. Those programs began before the implementation and before some of the tragedies that we've seen in Afghanistan. But nonetheless, we tried to make sure that we are relevant in the discussions that take place. The first program I did in that series featured David Petraeus and Sir John Scarlett. The second one, former National Security Advisor, good friend of mine, H.R. McMaster. And our third one featured the former ambassador to Pakistan, David Hale, who is a scholar at the Wilson Center, and journalists and analysts from South Asia. Our next program, which will be coming up in probably a week or so, will feature scholars from both our Kennan and Kissinger Institutes, which will essentially focus on answering the question, why is it that Russia and China aren't leaving Afghanistan, and why did they oppose the UN Security Council resolution basically condemning extremism and the attacks in Afghanistan. Another way that I try to make ourselves relevant, at least in terms of my own personal role, I started an op-ed, a column, a blog back a few months ago that I call Stubborn Things. That's of my own creation. So that harkens back to what John Adams once said. Many of you will remember not long after the Boston Massacre, when he was a defense attorney for unpopular clients, British soldiers. And he said very eloquently, look, facts are stubborn things. And what I try to do with the program that I have is to pull together, to drill down on individual facts that perhaps grab attention, but are emblematic of larger principles and larger challenges and larger scenarios that we see in the world. As an example of such things, I point out that in China, the government of China has banned the use of Facebook inside China. And yet outside China, the Communist Party of China is one of the largest advertisers on Facebook. I point out that 83% of all counterfeit goods that are seized by US Customs and Border Patrol last year emanated from China. Another stubborn thing or fact that I try to point out is that with displacement where it is in the world today, on average, one person was displaced every single day, every single second of every single day last year. 83 million people are displaced in every corner of the world. I also try to point out in my Stubborn Things that we have to care what takes place in other parts of the world, and that Americans are too often engaged in tunnel vision. We don't appreciate the opportunities, the challenges, and the resources that are in other parts of the world. More than a stubborn thing, more than half of the world's lithium is found in just 3 South American countries: Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile. And of course, lithium has sometimes been referred to as white gold for its importance in so many of the innovations we're seeing in the technology front. So Americans often look here at home, but we have to take care about what takes place in South America and elsewhere. Or I point out that with our changing climate and the conditions that that creates, that we have to understand the scale of the problem. So, for example, a stubborn thing. In June of 2021, Brazil's Amazon rainforest for the first time became a net emitter of greenhouse gases. So many of us have thought about the great forests of the world, especially the Amazon, as being what they call a greenhouse gas sink. In other words, it reduces greenhouse gas emissions, but because of man's exploitation of these resources, it's a net emitter. Or in the case, another stubborn thing of the Arctic Circle, I point out that Russia is the only country in the world that has nuclear-powered icebreakers, a dozen of them. And they're now making nuclear-powered icebreakers for China. So stubborn things. My own personal way of trying to make sure that the scholarship that we get is made relevant to what's taking place today. Before I turn it over to questions, I began by citing Labor Day and a particular experience I had is emblematic to me of how we do have to care about what takes place around the world and how the challenges that we see often come from the most remote regions. I'd like to close with another memory from a national holiday. And this goes back to July 4th, American Independence Day of 2008, when I was serving as ambassador in Tanzania. Those of you who have traveled overseas, know that Independence Day for any country is the most important day in the diplomatic calendar. It certainly is true for Americans. So at any US embassy around the world, July 4th is a big occasion. And most of the proceedings that take place on July 4th, on Independence Day at an embassy, are very ceremonial, very protocol oriented. The members of the diplomatic community in that particular country all arrive at the embassy with their black sedans with the little country flags flying. I remember as I look back on 2008 that I had my senior team out there greeting each dignitary as they arrived. I remember my Marine contingent formally posting the colors. I also remember the lengths that I went to in Tanzania to try to make the American community there feel a little bit of Americana. So I had served at the embassy gathering hot dogs and cheeseburgers. I had red, white, and blue everywhere. I had some fireworks. And yes, I had a cheesehead beer coaster or two on tables. In those ceremonies around Independence Day, the highlight of the day, the highlight of the evening, are the ceremonial speeches that are given. Mine as ambassador, plus in terms of protocol, a formal response from a representative of the host country, from the representative of the Tanzanian government. In 2008, when I was ambassador, I spent a lot of time researching and preparing the remarks that I would give that evening. As a recovering politician, I'd given my share of speeches and given my share of speeches on July 4th, but I wanted to do something special. And so when the moment came that evening, I had a well-written speech. I spoke of King George and Thomas Jefferson. I spoke of the Stamp Act, the Sons of Liberty, and the Boston Tea Party. I remember that I quoted from passages of the Declaration of Independence, from "We hold these truths to be self-evident," to "pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." And I think I actually delivered my speech pretty well, even if I do say so myself. And when I was done, I saw some encouraging applause and some heads nodding, and so I felt pretty good. But then came our Tanzanian speaker. It was a young minister in the government who had actually gotten his graduate degree right here in the US. And he was very much the personification of a young African leader, of the kind of leader that represents Africa's hopeful future. He was very smart, very sophisticated, very smooth. And when he reached the podium that evening, he pulled out his formally prepared script from a nicely tailored suit, and he began unfolding it. But then he paused, looked at everybody, folded it back up, and he said softly that he didn't need it. He looked at the Americans in the crowd, he relaxed, and then he said, "What I would say to you is simply this. We want to have what you have. We want to be who you are." And he stopped. And that was his entire speech. And I remember the crowd was stone silent. He just said it all. And he said it much better than I could have. He gave a speech that put mine to shame. And what that young African leader understood, I think, is what too many Americans seem to forget. When America struggles, it's not because our challenges are so great, but I think it's because all too often we forget who we are and what it is that we stand for, and the principles that are at the heart of our nation and its founding and our history, and at our best moments, what should be at the heart of our future, our leadership and our foreign policy. That's what brought me to the Wilson Center. That's really the kind of principle or set of principles that I've tried to keep in mind as I've had the good fortune to be involved in foreign policy in a number of ways. And so again, thank you for the opportunity. I wish I were with you, because that would mean that I'd have a chance to go to Memorial Union before or after. But it is good at least to hook up with so many of my friends in Madison, even virtually and even remotely. So Melanie, again, thanks for the opportunity, and I look forward to discussing things further. Melanie, I think you're still muted.
Okay, excuse me. Yeah, I didn't realize I'm rarely muted. Okay, let's start again. Will our experience in Afghanistan finally convince Americans that we can no longer police the world and impose our values in that larger arena?
Well, so sure. Yes, thanks for the question. And I've got a different point of view. So one of the activities that I engaged in over the last couple of years, I actually served on the Afghanistan study group, the often cited report that came out from a team hosted by the U.S. Institute of Peace. And it was bipartisan, and it was co-chaired by former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dunford, and Senator Ayotte. And if you take a look at that Afghan study group report, and that report is available online from USIP, I think it laid out a pretty good set of options and a pretty good plan for Afghanistan. It pointed out that we have not had casualties, we have not had deaths in Afghanistan for 18 months up until the terrible tragedy recently. We had a modest footprint there. We had about 2,500 troops there, and they were in a non-combat role. And they were helping the government of Afghanistan to stand up, to try to guarantee opportunities for women in marginalized communities. And they were also there as a hedge against counterterrorism and the reemergence of Al-Qaeda. And I think that was a pretty good model. And so in that case, it wasn't a matter of our imposing values. I mean, if you spend time talking to young Afghan women who are now, or until recently, helping to represent their country diplomatically, serving key roles in the government, taking their place in corporate boardrooms in Afghanistan, and turning around and lifting up their people. I don't know that is imposing American values. I think instead it is unlocking universal values of opportunity, of human dignity, of freedom and liberty. So I look at it a little bit differently. And also I would point out, we have forces in many parts of the world, in places, of course, in South Korea and Germany, and those are not seen as imposing values. We were there at the invitation of a duly elected government. So I look at it a little bit differently. If you look back at the programs that we did, hindsight up front, I think you'll see I have a point of view about what's taken place. I'm very concerned. I think it is going to cause new waves of misery. There are 3 million Afghan refugees already in places like Pakistan, and it's about to get much, much worse. So I'm deeply concerned. And I think having a modest presence there, again, in a non-combat role, I think was something that was sustainable for the foreseeable future. The Afghanistan Study Group report talked about having that modest presence there with an eventual conditions-based transition. And to me, that made some sense.
Okay. The next question is, wait a minute. It's come to some people's attention that some of the military leaders that have been involved in Afghanistan are now going around giving speeches for as much as $60,000 a speech. And the question is that, are some of our past military leaders really benefiting from financially from our involvement in Afghanistan?
Well, first off, when you get to the level of a 2- and 3-star general, yes, they are sought after for speaking engagements and consultancies and occasionally boards. That isn't as a result of Afghanistan. That was true before Afghanistan and is true in many places for many officials who have not been active in Afghanistan. So I'm not sure I tie the two together. In the case of David Petraeus and H.R. McMaster, they have made remarkable contributions, I think, to scholarship. H.R. McMaster's book, Battlefields, I think is a marvelous book capturing where the world is in terms of its challenges for any student. And of course, his previous book on failures regarding Vietnam was well regarded, and that was long before he took a leadership role. So I understand the point, but I'm not sure I'd tie them together like that.
Okay. The next question and comment is, Ambassador Green, it is comforting to have Wisconsin sensibilities in place like the Wilson Institute. As you mentioned, the aspiration of people in developing countries to be like us, what role in your mind does the characteristic of humility play in responding to that? In other words, how do the parts of our history and economic experience where we have prospered from the rich natural gifts given to us by the continent and our reticence and our reliance on the losses experienced by indigenous people and lives as a result of our success?
Yeah, it's a great question. So President Biden said something a couple of months ago that I thought was very well put. And it was in the context of some of the cases that we've seen calling for civil justice reform, the obvious challenges that we've seen violence against minority communities. And he said, great nations face their problems. And he's right. When I was ambassador in Tanzania, what I used to say to the government and to audiences I work with it, I'd say, look, I'm not saying that we've got all the answers. I'm saying that we've probably made all of the mistakes. And what we say to our friends around the world is, you don't have to make the same mistakes that we have made, and that you get to leapfrog us. You can stand on our shoulders and learn from our mistakes. I think it's important for us to fess up to our shortcomings, and they are many. We do not have a perfect union. We are in pursuit of a perfect union, but in so many ways we have fallen short. But what separates us from most other nations is our willingness to look openly and look at our problems, fess up to them, and dedicate ourselves to taking them on. And those who pretend that we don't have problems, or that somehow, we're perfect because we're America, first off, I don't agree. And secondly, I think that is a disservice to our framers. They weren't saints, very obviously, and didn't pretend to be. We have made mistakes. We should admit to them. So I think humility should be part of foreign policy. That doesn't mean weakness. I don't think weaknesses and humility are synonyms. I think we fess up to our problems, our shortcomings, but I think we should be very clear on what we stand for.
The next question is, with Tanzania as a third world example, what are the best ways to encourage good leaders, and what mistakes have we often made?
Great question. So, I dearly love Tanzania. It's in some ways, my second home. The mistakes that we have made is, I think sometimes, we aren't clear-eyed in working with countries. There's something I used to say to my team at the U.S. Agency for International Development. Look, we can't want it more than they do. Democracy is not something to be imposed. It obviously is not democracy if it is imposed. What we need to look for are leaders and communities that are interested in what I often refer to as the journey to self-reliance, the opportunity to rise themselves. Where we find leaders that are willing to pursue the tough choices and the reforms that are at the heart of achieving self-reliance, then I think we have a moral obligation to walk with them along the way, to help provide tools and to help provide opportunities. But we also have to understand that we shouldn't impose our will. We can't impose our will. That's a disservice to the countries that we're looking at, but also a disservice to ourselves.
And Ambassador Green, we've been concerned about China involvement in Africa, and I'm just curious, is leadership development something that they are interested in, also in addition to and so forth? Yeah.
It's interesting, and Tanzania is an interesting case in point, because the Chinese have been actively engaged in Tanzania for a very long time. China was one of the first countries to recognize the United Republic of Tanzania when it achieved full independence in the early 60s. So they have a deep history. So you heard me talk a few moments ago about this notion of the journey to self-reliance, of helping countries to be able to rise up and take on their own challenges, which means helping to build capacity where we should help to build capacity. It's being honest in terms of our analysis of challenges that we see in the tools that we have. China offers a very different model. when I was at USAID, I tried to evaluate the investments that we would make, the grants that we would make, the training programs that we would make, by measuring how far that would help a country proceed on that journey towards greater self-reliance, being able to take on their own challenges. In the case of China, if a Chinese investment helps a country to be more self-reliant, essentially back in Beijing, someone's upset because that's the opposite of what it is that they hope to achieve. We look for self-reliance, and Chinese investments in most cases seem to be more about building greater dependence on China. And so it's a stark contrast. I worry sometimes that in the US and in our foreign assistance programs, we essentially tried to match China. We tried to deliver stuff. We tried to match dollar for dollar. That's not our comparative advantage. Our comparative advantage in great power competition is how different we are. The fact that our power is based upon effective alliances, and effective alliances are alliances and partnerships among equal nations. They are alliances of the willing. China doesn't do that. China's power is based upon authoritarian control, a lack of transparency, and dependency on the central government in Beijing. To me, that contrast is the greatest value that we have. But there is absolutely no doubt that China is very heavily engaged in Africa, making investments in nearly every single country. What's always difficult in evaluating Chinese investments, they're opaque. We don't get to see the terms of the deal. When you look at USAID and go to our website, you can see where USAID invests. You can see the programs that we undertake. It's public, it's transparent. I used to get hauled up to Congress several times a year to have to answer questions in writing on the details of what we do. I guarantee that isn't taking place in Beijing. That contrast to me is the great advantage that we have, as long as we're willing to make it a key part of our messaging. I worry too much that we are worried solely about the dollars going in. Now, the lead of the Kissinger Institute, the Wilson Center, is a wonderful scholar by the name of Robert Daly, one of the top China hands really anywhere in the world, certainly in the US. He also says that it's important that Americans don't get lulled into fear of the unknown. He said, sometimes we act as though the Chinese are 10 feet tall. He said, they're not 10 feet tall, but we tend to think that way because we don't understand them very well. And we don't always have a good window onto what they're doing. So I think it's important that we invest in research on China and scholarship on China, that we come to understand what takes place in China. Obviously, China is a rival. It is a superpower. It is often an unfriendly superpower, but closing our eyes isn't going to make them go away. So it's important that we understand what they're doing and that we understand what our comparative advantage is.
The next question is, how can we, under universal values, work universally to curb human trafficking?
Great question. And human trafficking is something that I was very engaged in attacking human trafficking when I was at the McCain Institute. It's a personal cause of Cindy McCain. Human trafficking, often called modern slavery, is one of the great scourges of humanity in the world today. And we have to go at all parts of the chain in human trafficking. We have to attack demand. We have to attack supply. We have to spend more time creating safe places and safe refuges for the victims of trafficking. But one of the most important things we need to do is empower women. Human trafficking is often as a result of women being extraordinarily vulnerable, particularly displaced women who are on the move. They have few places they can turn to, few places, few means for survival, and that makes them terribly vulnerable to those who traffic in human beings. So I think that's something important to do. You know, we have the human trafficking report that comes out every year, and we have sanctions that are attached to it. The Trump administration did a very good job in elevating it. I'm confident the Biden administration will continue to elevate it in foreign policy. But we also have to recognize that human trafficking takes place here. Labor trafficking that we've seen in many parts of the US, we have to be honest with ourselves and with the world that this is one of those areas where we need to look at ourselves and look at what's taking place in too many parts of this country as well.
Yes, it takes place in Madison, Wisconsin, I can tell you that. The next question is the Wilson Center concerned about the Chinese practice of debt finance development, projects in which China can assume control of investment when countries are unable to pay off their loans? China is now threatening to take control of the airport in Juba, South Sudan.
Absolutely. So debt finance is unsustainable. Debt finance is one of the principal tools that China uses in many parts of the world. And you're seeing it lead to countries surrendering their birthright in terms of natural resources, from ports to precious minerals. And that is a great concern. And that's why I talk about being clear on the difference between the Chinese model and the US model. The vast majority of what we do is not heavily collateralized loans. We at USAID provide assistance. The AIDS initiative, PEPFAR, those are not loans. That comes from the generosity of the American taxpayer, and nothing is asked for in return. President Biden has said over and over again what we are doing in terms of the vaccines that we are producing, and distributing. We don't seek anything in return. These aren't loans. These are instead a helping hand that we provide to countries in need in their time of need. You know, one of the areas that or one of the topics for which I'm very proud to be an American is America's role in humanitarian assistance. So USAID is an unusual agency in that it does both development assistance and humanitarian assistance. And those are two very, very different things. Development assistance, again, at least when I was there, we tried to put in this model of helping countries to help themselves and to rise up. Humanitarian assistance is provided to countries in their time of need, and it's done without regard to politics. So we provide humanitarian assistance to people in need in countries that are not close allies of the US and may even be enemies of the US because it's humanitarian. China does almost no humanitarian assistance. In fact, up until a few years ago, they did none at all. But because they were shamed for it, they're providing modest amounts now. The US is the #1 contributor of humanitarian assistance in the world. And last time I checked, 2, 3, and 4 added together don't equal what we do. I'm proud of that. I think that's an American value. I think it's something that does create a sense of America being an aspirational force for good in this world. And so that is something to do. Look, I would love for China to take its seat at the table of responsible nations in terms of helping other parts of the world. I think it would be fantastic if China would provide humanitarian assistance to a greater extent. I think it would be great if China were to make investments in global health around the world and not seek something in return. that isn't where we are right now, and hopefully that will change.
What about Russia and its humanitarian assistance? Does it assist other countries other than those that used to be part of the Soviet Union?
I'm not aware of Russia doing much of anything in the humanitarian assistance ground. Russia does a lot of military assistance, as we know, not usually a force for good in that regard. China is obviously heavily engaged, particularly in Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe. Oftentimes, the government is a force, a chaotic force. They seem to thrive on disunity. They seem to thrive on undermining democracy. And that's where I've seen more of their work. I have not run into them at donor conferences. I have not seen them in my times in Africa. I don't, Tanzania, as you may know, has one of the largest Peace Corps contingents in the world. It was the second country to receive Peace Corps volunteers. I haven't run into Russian volunteer teachers, Russian volunteer nurses. That's not something you see a great deal of. Again, it would be fantastic for these countries to join us in these humanitarian exercises, but it's not something that we see. Russia's arrival in many parts of the world, particularly in the Arctic, Melanie, as you and I were talking about, Russia's making a big show of its military presence in the Arctic. The US policy is that the Arctic, that there should be free navigation, and investments that are made there should be for the benefit of the communities there, particularly indigenous communities, but there should be free research, and it should be something that's seen as an opportunity for the world, not for the advancement of a particular set of interests from a particular country.
I'm curious what you think about how we will have a leadership role in Europe now with the change in Germany's leadership and, sort of lots of kind of instability in other European countries. What's your perception of what's going to happen there?
Well, you point to the German elections, and obviously those are very important elections in so many ways. Angela Merkel has played a very prominent role, if not the leading role, in European affairs. And it's a passing of the torch or changing of the guard, and will clearly have some ramifications. I think something to watch in Europe is the fallout from Afghanistan. As we see refugees head north, obviously the largest number are going into Pakistan in the immediate area, but the movement of refugees in Europe has led too often to the rise of a pernicious form of populism that has unsettled politics there. And that's something I worry about once again. In terms of transatlantic relations, I think we sometimes focus exclusively on Asia. We see the economic rivalry with China, and obviously it's important, especially with China and the size of its economy. But we should not forget that transatlantic trade and the trade within the Americas drive so much economic opportunity and really are a source of strength. I think it's important that we continue to build close transatlantic relationships, that we look for greater commerce. We look to work closely together on common challenges like battling terrorism, the threat of terrorism, and also responding to the challenges that come with human displacement. So it's a slightly unsettled time, but it's a relationship, the transatlantic relationship, that I don't think we spend enough time working on. I think we take it for granted too quickly, too easily. And it's unfortunate because US-Europe relations have always been there, and they've been a key part of what has driven the world in a good direction, a good force for good.
Who do you think is going to take the leadership in this North Atlantic situation? Because I agree with you as what we've seen happening in Sweden, what we've seen happening the Nordic countries with the influx of refugees. And it seems like particularly Sweden has been having great deal of difficulties in coping with this change in their demographics and so forth. I'm just wondering, of those countries, the North Atlantic countries, who might be the natural leader to come out?
Well, and I'm not sure I have the answer to that, but what I can say is we're touching upon something that I think is, for me, very, very important personally. The Wilson Quarterly, which is our award-winning scholarly publication, the issue that comes out towards the end of October is called Humanity in Motion, and it focuses exclusively on the displacement of human beings. We have more than 83 million displaced people in the world. People are not where they were, and in many cases not where they're going to be, and they're in motion. And I think it is, in some ways, in the long term, the great challenge of this generation, because you see the havoc it sometimes wreaks on our democratic systems. People fear the unknown. People often are worried about a loss of their, their culture. Instead of really, there was a study done a few years ago that I thought was interesting, and it looked back at waves of immigration to the US. And in so many cases, Americans looked at whatever the current wave was, and they were concerned and they expressed negative attitudes. But when they looked at the preceding wave, they said, yeah, not a problem. And so there are sometimes rubs. And then after a while, as people begin to understand each other better, and we realize that we all have a stake in the survival of a country, of an economy, of a community, I remain very optimistic. My great fear related to human displacement, you have the obvious material challenges. It is very hard for those young mothers who are in motion, who are displaced, to get proper nutrition, proper healthcare, proper educational opportunities. And so you see them being made more and more vulnerable to the worst kinds of exploitation. But in some ways, even greater than that is what I saw in fact, one of my very first trips overseas as administrator, when I visited Burma. I went to camps where all of the children that I met had been born in that camp. They had never left the camp. And we see that the average age or the average length of time of displacement is 15 years and rising. It's going up every year because in most cases, these individuals are not going home. They are permanently displaced. And I worry that we have a generation of young people who are growing up disconnected to the world around them because they've been growing up in a camp setting or in a displaced setting, not only not having proper access to education, but not having access to civic education. And it means that they are not equipped to participate in the world around them. And that's a terrible tragedy. And it's a failure on our part. I will say that Henrietta Fore, who was just finishing up as the head of UNICEF and is a dear friend, I asked her what her recommendations would be to US policymakers as she leaves UNICEF. And she said, it's very clear. She said, provide internet to every refugee camp in the world. Connect young people, not just young people, but focusing for the moment on young people, to the world around them. The world will be richer for it. in their contributions, but it also attacks some of the vulnerability that's there. So I'm very worried that the waves of displacement that we're seeing, and they're every corner of the world, from Venezuela to Southeast Asia, everywhere we look, we're seeing human displacement, and it's unsettling our systems, strains on our democracy, and also creating, I think, a wave of vulnerable people whose prospects are dim, and that's a terrible tragedy for humanity.
One last question. How does one become a Wilson Scholar?
So you can go to our website and go through the process. The good or bad news is I have nothing to do with it. So there are committees of the board and scholars who help to review applications. Very competitive process, but I just am as proud as you can imagine to even be associated with this group. Again, Madeleine Albright's become a very good friend, and she told me that she was a Wilson Center scholar. But Peter Baker, who just wrote that wonderful book with his wife on the biography of James Baker. Yeah, it's a neat group. It's a very neat group to be associated with, and the fact that they allow me in the door and they don't make fun of me clearly not being a scholar, I think I'm in a pretty good place. I'm a pretty lucky guy.
Well, we feel pretty lucky that you were with us this evening, and it's been really very interesting to have your insights and your knowledge in these areas, and we do appreciate it, and welcome home anytime you can come back.
You got it. I'll take you up on that.
Okay, good night.
Thanks. Good night, everyone.